Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. My name's Matt Freese, and I will actually be your solo host today. Unfortunately, both Nick and Greg are kind of busy this week. They have some conflicts, but we still thought it was important to get out a reaction to the Vikings Week 2 preseason game. Just keep the content rolling for you guys, and we'll kind of see as we go along here. We'll get Nick and Greg back into the fold, and we'll be doing more probably around the roster cut day and after the third preseason game in the next couple weeks. And then obviously we'll be with you every single week during the NFL season. So what I wanted to talk about today is just kind of go over players and performances that stood out for me during that Tennessee Titans game, week 2 of the preseason. And I'm kind of going to do it by just going through the roster. I did a 53-man roster projection earlier this week. I just posted it to Twitter. You can find it on my Twitter profile there. I don't tweet like 1,000 things a day, so it should be pretty easy to find just by scrolling down a little bit. And obviously this is kind of my personal view of what I might do if I'm the Vikings, and I'm not going to hit on every single player of the 53-man roster. Obviously a player like Justin Jefferson is a lock, and he hasn't played in the preseason, so there's no news, or Kirk Cousins or any of the other starters really we don't need to talk a ton about. But I think it's interesting to look at the fringe roster players and kind of talk about their performances and maybe who's earning more of a spot over some other players on the team. So I'm going to go down by the position, start kind of with the offense first, and then go through towards the defensive end of the ball. So first out, starting with the quarterbacks, Nick Mullins isn't really all that interesting to me to talk about. I think he's a solid backup. I think he's played okay. I think he's shown what you expect out of Nick Mullins, frankly, in the 2 games for preseason we've seen, which is somebody who's going to go ahead and try to run a steady ship with the team if Kirk Cousins gets hurt. Obviously, it's not an ideal scenario to have Nick Mullins starting. He'd have to be dragged to wins by the supporting cast rather than, being the person who leads the team to wins. But that's kind of what it is. I mean, that's kind of what you sign up for most backup quarterbacks in the NFL. Jaren Hall, I do have making the roster. I think that the fact that you can have an emergency third quarterback designated on game day makes a significant difference in the calculus of whether or not you want to keep 3 quarterbacks. I don't think Hall is necessarily somebody we'd be able to sneak onto the practice squad. I think kind of like Kellen Mond was cut last year and the Browns picked him up, although he just got cut because he hasn't played very well. Hall probably had enough suitors in the draft range where some team would take a flyer on him, especially with the rule that you can have 3 quarterbacks on active for game day to put him on your active roster. So for the Vikings to keep him, and I want them to, with the potential to develop him, the Vikings, I think, would have to keep him on that 53-man roster. Hall's game specifically, I think we got to see more from Hall in this game than we did in the previous game. The last game was just so absolutely littered with pressure that he was under that I really don't think there was a ton to evaluate him off of. There were a couple quick game throws that he missed. One really nice throw where he threaded the needle in the first game. But this second game, we had a little bit more, and we saw him on rollouts. We saw him on the move. I thought he generally did a pretty good job distributing the football overall. I will say I thought there were a couple of accuracy issues that showed up in this game as well. Some areas where he's just not pinpoint at this point in his career, which is kind of interesting because I thought he was generally a very accurate quarterback in college. So there are just throws I'd like to see him do better on, frankly, and I'm hoping that that's coming with getting used to the speed of the NFL game, right? He's had, I'm sure, a ton to learn throughout the entirety of the offseason, from the structure of the offense to exactly what he needs to do on dropbacks to he's looking 1 to 2 to 3, that sort of thing. And I thought it was a relatively advanced college quarterback, but the NFL is just kind of a step up from that. So for Hall, maybe the footwork or maybe some of the techniques that allowed him to be accurate in college are lagging behind as he's kind of swimming in the game, and he needs more experience to be able to get that down. I think, being on the Vikings roster as a backup, maybe getting in work with the scout team, right? He's kind of an athletic quarterback, so maybe he can try to mimic some of the more athletic quarterbacks in the NFL, just kind of being immersed in the Vikings staff for a year, being immersed in their processes, in their play calls, all that stuff being in the room might help him develop to be a better quarterback next year. Now, with that being said, I mean, it hasn't been super promising for Hall. It hasn't been something that's so disastrous like the Kellen Mond example, where Kellen Mond just did not look like he could function at an NFL level at all. I think Hall, you've seen some brighter flashes than we did with Mond, but it's still certainly a work in progress for him. So flipping over to the running backs, obviously Alex Madison appears to be the entrenched starter. But one player I really want to talk about and highlight here has been Ty Chandler, who has surpassed my expectations for what I thought he was going to be coming into this offseason, frankly. I currently have Ty Chandler as the RB2 on the Vikings, and that was not what I was expecting. Now, if I'm being honest, I didn't love Dwayne McBride coming in as a 7th round pick. Like, I had some questions about him. And I kind of expected Kenny Nwangwu to actually take over the RB2 role. Obviously, Nwangwu has not had the opportunity because he's been injured. And for the record, I did end up cutting Dwayne McBride on this 53-man roster projection I made, so I only kept the 3 running backs, assuming Nwangwu was going to be healthy for the season. And the indications from the Vikings are that, he's kind of day-to-day, and I think he probably is a player that will be back for the beginning of the season. But with Chandler, I've been impressed with a couple things. So first of all, I mean, I know he was extremely explosive at North Carolina. He ran a super fast 40, and that was kind of the hallmark of his game, right, is his speed. And he showed that with burst. But I thought he's also been a pretty wise player in terms of his decision-making running the ball. Like, he's been able to fit through a couple of very small creases that I was impressed by. He's been able to lower the pads and fall forward in a number of areas. And he's been able to show good contact balance. Like, he's bounced off of players in the backfield. He's made guys miss. Just by working through a wrap to his legs, which is a pretty difficult wrap. I mean, it was a linebacker who was diving into his side and tried to wrap him at the waist, but still, that's not something that it's easy to work through, and he was able to spin out of that and lower his pads and get a couple extra yards. There was one really fun play, and this was against the Seahawks, I believe, where Austin Schlottman was engaged with a defending player, and Nwangwu actually went under the nose tackle that Schlottman was blocking. Like, he was between the center and the guy who he was physically blocking. He went under and kind of fell forward for a couple extra yards, so that was nice. In the passing game, Ty Chandler has also shown a couple things. There was and this was more in the Seahawks game, but there was a throw to the flat where he had a corner come up to tackle him almost as soon as he caught the ball. He made that guy miss. There was another play where he understood the positioning of the linebacker. So he caught the ball, understood where the linebacker was approaching him from, and actually turned around against that linebacker's momentum and gained a first down. Those are back-to-back plays. So, it's nice that he has kind of shown a feel for the game, I think, in the preseason. And his numbers haven't been super impressive, right? He's gotten 65 yards on 22 carries, which is less than 3 yards a carry. But that's in line with what the rest of the Vikings offense has done. I just don't think the offensive line has blocked very well for Chandler so far this preseason. So on top of that, I think what I've been really impressed with, maybe really impressed is going a little bit too far, but what I've found nice from Chandler is I think you can put him on the field on third downs, not just because of the pass catching ability, which I kind of mentioned already, but he's done very well reading pass protection. And what I mean by that is when you're a running back, you have in a protection call, you need to understand where the offensive line is weak and help that out. So a lot of protections are 3 of the offensive linemen go to one side and they kind of zone it to that side where usually they're responsible for 2 players. But if there's a third player who blitzes on that side, they pick it up. And then on the back side of that, you have the guard and the tackle who are both responsible for 1 man each. In that scenario, the running back is responsible for any blitzes to that side. That's called a half slide protection. And Chandler, I think, has done very well in half-side protections in terms of identifying the players who are blitzing, who are his responsibility, and then blocking them. He's got a couple of things to clean up as he approaches blocking opposing linebackers who are blitzing against him. But there have certainly been a couple times where he's stalemated them. One play against the Titans that I want to highlight is one where Chandler started on the right side of the quarterback. So he started on the right side of Mullins, and the slide was actually to his side. So in that case, he needs to watch to the left and help out the left guard and left tackle if there's a blitzer to that side. There was, in fact, a linebacker from the Titans blitzing from that side, and Chandler goes over, crosses in front of the quarterback, and gets the block. Mullins got the pass off very quickly, but Chandler was in position to stop that player from making an impact on the play. And, it's just good to see him process that and get over there and make that play. That's not necessarily an easy block to make for a running back. The other example was from the Seahawks game where Chandler had it was a double A gap mug by the Seahawks. And in a double A gap look, typically the center is responsible for one of the two linebackers who are in the A gaps, and then the back is responsible for the other. So the center turned to his left on this play. That linebacker backed out, but Chandler was responsible for the linebacker on the right. But what they actually ran was there was a 3 technique to that side, and they ran a stunt with that linebacker and with the 3 technique. So the 3 technique cut across the right guard's face while the linebacker came in behind him. Chandler was able to diagnose this, and he was able to block the linebacker blitzing up the arc, which allowed, this was a Nick Mullins scramble. I think it was on 3rd down, and it didn't end up converting, but it created a wide lane for Nick Mullins to step up and scramble on that play. So Chandler very much did his job in that scenario. And that's something, pass protection is huge for a player who a team is going to put on the field on 3rd down. A lot of third down passing situations are, 3rd and long, and it's simply not feasible to just only protect with 5 in those scenarios because defenses often send blitz. If you only protect with 5 and you're very predictable in those scenarios, you're going to end up like the run and shoot offense, which died because it didn't have the pass protection capabilities of some other offenses that are in the league. So, that's important for Chandler. I think Madison's a good pass protector. So if Chandler wants to get those reps where he's a more explosive player, he's going to need to prove that he can play up to the level of Madison. And I think that he's made steps forward. One thing I do want him to improve on is his cut blocking ability. He whiffed on a couple cut blocks in both games. Now, passes got off in both of those scenarios. It was kind of a quick passing game scenario. But one time, so when you cut block, you want to try to go for your opponent's outside hip. You want to kind of cross his body and go for that opposite hip. The first time Chandler simply went too far and the player was able to get inside of him. And the second time he didn't go far enough. He wasn't able to get wide enough and the player went outside of him. So it's kind of a... it was kind of a guessing game for him, and he kind of lost it both times, which is a little bit disappointing. Fullback, I had CJ Ham. I don't think there's anything really to talk about there. He hasn't played at all during the preseason. Wide receiver, I think, obviously the starters are entrenched, right? Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne. Again, they're going to be the 3 main receivers, and the Vikings are going to run a lot of 11 personnel. We're going to see more 12 and 21 personnel than we did last year, I'm willing to bet. But I also think that, we're still going to base out of 11 personnel as an offense. So I ended up keeping 6 wide receivers on this projection, and that might be a little bit strong. Jalen Nailor, it sounds like, was back today for joint practices with Cardinals, so it's good to see him back on the practice field. He's a lock to make the roster, assuming health there. So the final 2 receivers I kept on my roster were Jalen Reagor and Brandon Powell. I would put Powell in over Reagor. I think Powell is kind of a roster lock at this point, given how Kevin O'Connell has talked about him in press conferences and the like. And I do think that Reagor and Powell kind of fill a similar role. Obviously, they're both competing for the punt return job. Powell is a small receiver. Jalen Reagor I think he's somewhere in the 5'11" range, and he's pretty rocked up, frankly, for a receiver. But they kind of occupy the same view as receivers in my mind, so it may not be wise to keep both of them with kind of a redundant skill set there. But I just think Reagor has played well enough in the preseason to justify that. I don't know. He had like 2 catches in the Titans game, but I was very impressed with what I saw from him in that Seahawks game. And I've also been impressed with some of the refs that have come out of the Cardinals joint practices. Obviously, one-on-ones are always a caveat, but I think that he kind of has got it in this offense a little bit, and that was what was holding him back last year, right? Obviously, the Colts game, he had 2 terrible plays where he just wasn't on the same page as Kirk, but if he's able to get on the same page and able to understand the offense, he can be an explosive player. Obviously, he had a ton of talent, and that's why he was picked, 1 selection before Justin Jefferson. Like, he can be an incredibly explosive player if he can put it together, and I've seen him do receiver things in this preseason that were huge question marks to me, right? I didn't think he was able to do those things at all. So having seen the flashes, I'm kind of excited about him, and I want to try to keep him on this roster, which is frankly not something I expected to say before training camp at all. The other receivers who are there, I really think none of them have the ability to make the roster. N'Keal Harry got released today. None of the other ones have really stood out to me. Lucky Jackson, unfortunately, during the game, had a really nice route, and it was in one of those Ty Chandler blitz pickups where Nick Mullins threw him a ball that was on target. He just wasn't able to get both feet down in bounds, and that was kind of disappointing. He had a drop that I saw come out from the joint practices today where he ended up wide open as well. So unfortunately, I just don't think he's put it together from a catching the ball standpoint, and nobody else has really stood out to me. Blake Prohl, who I thought, might have a chance to sneak on the roster, had a couple drops in that game against the Titans, didn't look good catching the ball from Jaren Hall. They weren't perfect throws from Jaren Hall, right? I mentioned that Hall has had some accuracy issues, but I really think, if you want somebody, if you're Blake Prohl and you want to make the Vikings roster, you really, really need to catch those passes. Thayer Thomas, I think number 89, is probably the only player, is probably the 7th receiver right now for me in terms of if you stacked him up. But I just don't think he's there to make the roster. In addition to keeping the 6 wide receivers, and this kind of got a lot of comments, I kept 4 tight ends as well. And I think after, seeing people say that, I kind of am on the same page where I don't think the Vikings are going to end up keeping 4 tight ends. But the problem is I just like all 4 of the guys. I think Johnny Munt's kind of a roster lock. The Vikings kept him out of that second preseason game. But Nick Muse has played really well this preseason. I think he got a bad PFF grade from the Titans game, and I don't really understand it at all. There was a really nice play where it was actually where Oli Udoh allowed one of his 2 sacks in the game, where Nick Muse just chipped a guy I think it was a defensive back who was blitzing, knocked him completely off his path, completely out of the play, and then got out kind of fluidly into the route. He, had, I think it was 3 catches for 40-something yards or 4 catches. He led the Vikings in receiving in the second game, and there was one where I think he, and it might have been Reagor, ran like the exact same route, or they ran very close in the vicinity, and they were both kind of curl routes. Was it a 3rd down? I'm not exactly sure, but he caught the ball, extended his arms outside the frame, broke a tackle that was immediately there while he was catching the football, and ended up getting down the field. One, he was open in the flat, I believe, and got a bunch of extra yards, but his 3rd catch showed some pretty solid after catch ability as well. Obviously, in the Seahawks game, he had that very impressive touchdown catch, and I thought he's been very good as a blocker throughout 2 games too. So I've just been impressed with Muse and would like to see the Vikings try to keep him on the roster. We have seen a bunch of 2 tight end sets from the Vikings. They've played it on about 40 snaps where they've had 2 tight ends in the game. So that may lead to them keeping 4 tight ends. But people have made very good points that the Vikings, even back in 2022, where we ran a ton of 12 personnel, where we're using 2 tight ends, 2 running backs, heavy sets the whole time, we only kept 3 tight ends. So that might be a little bit of a pipe dream for Nick Muse, but I'd like to see him kept around at the very least on the practice squad. If we jump over to the offensive line, I've been frankly terribly disappointed with the performance of the offensive line. Like, Blake Brandel, in terms of the backups, is the only one I really want to keep on the roster at this point. And I know that's not realistic, right? The Vikings are probably going to keep at least 9 or 10 linemen on the team. They have pretty much every season. Most teams keep 9 or 10 offensive linemen on their initial 53-man rosters, or, carry them on their 53-man rosters throughout the year. There's a pretty big question mark for the Vikings, and that's the status of Chris Reed, who's currently on the non-football injury list, probably for something he sustained working out. I don't actually know what the exact nature of that is, and the problem is we don't know when Reed's going to be back with the team, right? So he kind of leaves a question mark as an open spot. If you want to say Reed's going to be back after week 1, the team can leave him off. I think they can keep the NFI designation, or they can keep some sort of physically unable to perform designation going on there for him into the first couple weeks. But, then you still need to keep 8 offensive linemen at a bare minimum, I would think, with the intent of adding another one after the roster cutdown day. So your options kind of become Vidarian Lowe and Oli Udoh, who have been the 2 tackles. I haven't been super impressed with Lowe, but I think he's played significantly better than Oli Udoh, who has had an absolutely disastrous preseason to me. He allowed 2 sacks in this past game. The first one was very clearly on him. And the problem I have is this is going against backups, right? You're going against players who are trying to make the roster as well. I think both of these sacks were in the second half. And it wasn't like Jaron Hall was holding onto the ball in the second half. Even if they were against Nick Mullins, it's not like either of them were holding onto the ball unnecessarily in these situations. Well, so the first one, very clearly, Mullins was not, I think it was Mullins, was not holding onto the ball unnecessarily. Udoh just got beat extremely quickly to the inside. I don't think he's been very good in run blocking either. The Vikings, obviously, I talked about with Ty Chandler, have been horrible running the ball in the preseason. They've averaged 3 yards per attempt with their running backs, and a big part of that is there's just absolutely nothing open on the offensive line. The offensive linemen simply aren't getting the job done in the run blocking game. So Udoh has struggled quite a bit. The 1 sack was certainly on him. The second sack was sort of a coverage sack. The quarterback held it on for like 3 hitches or so, but also Udoh was faced with a stunt, got beat inside. He and Brandel did not pass it off. That was a decision that they made. It wasn't like Brandel was supposed to keep to switch off with him, and Brandel blocked his guy on that stunt. He did a very admirable job, whereas Udoh let him get the better of him inside and let him get up to the quarterback. Vidarian Lowe, on the other end, also allowed a sack in this game, where it was kind of similar to a coverage sack as well, where it was a couple hitches from the quarterback. The quarterback had nowhere to go on this play, and this was Jaron Hall for sure, but he ended up getting beat inside eventually, and that's not something I like to see from offensive linemen. Like, Lowe, I think I have some questions with him oversetting, because I don't think he has the quickness that you might want for an offensive tackle, and he looks pretty big out there, which is also nice to see, but you want to be big and quick for an offensive tackle, right? So if he's going to overset and end up getting beat inside, that's about the worst case scenario for an offensive lineman. That's the quickest path to the quarterback for your opponent, so you really want to avoid that happening. Blake Brandel, on the flip side, I do want to say I've been extremely impressed with Blake Brandel in this preseason. I think I like that they're cross-training him at guard, because I think if any of the 5 starting offensive linemen go down, with the exception of our center, right? I don't want Blake Brandel out there trying to learn to snap or anything, but if any of those 4 guards or tackles go out, I think Blake Brandel's the first person in, which is kind of why they're cross-training him at the guard position this year, so he gets that experience where he's already had experience at the tackle positions. So I certainly want him on the team. Chris Reed, I kind of want to keep by default if I'm getting rid of Oli Udoh, who I do kind of want to move on from, and I haven't liked what I've seen out of Austin Schlottman at all either this preseason. So the problem here is I'm trashing the Vikings backup offensive linemen, right? But we've seen over the years that it's really hard to add offensive linemen. Like, there's a dearth of offensive linemen in the NFL. It's not easy to find them. I don't think it's going to necessarily be easy for the Vikings to pick somebody up who somebody else has let go of, because that means that they're probably not very good either, right, at roster cutdown day. So I fully expect the Vikings to keep 9 or 10 offensive linemen, and with the ones they're keeping, maybe it's, I expect it to be Lowe, Brandell, and Udo at the least, or if they have to move on from, if they want to move on from one of the tackles because Blake Brandell's a tackle and they only want to keep 9 guys if Chris Reed's back healthy, then Schlotman, who's a backup center. I do think they need a backup center, a guy who can snap the ball, and that's who Schlotman is. If they keep Chris Reed, I think Reed can also theoretically be a backup center. One other thing I haven't mentioned here is that and Krauser and Stizo, I think both actually mentioned this on Twitter. I went earlier and I was like, I couldn't remember which one it was, and I looked it up, and both of them actually mentioned it to me, that Olio Udo is on a veteran benefit contract, which means he's getting paid around the range of $2 million this year, and that's fully guaranteed for him. However, his cap hit, because there's a carve-out for veterans of a certain age, if you have you can have like one player with a higher contract who counts the veteran minimum, and that's Oli Udo for the Vikings. So I think he's pretty much guaranteed to stay and make the roster, despite my chagrin with his performance, because he ends up costing the Vikings more money to cut him than he does against the cap just for this season. So with that being said, on the offensive line, I'm going to flip it over to the defensive side of the ball. And on the interior defensive line, I kept 5 players: Harrison Phillips, Khyiris Tonga, Jaquelin Roy, Dean Lowry, and Jonathan Bullard. I think that's pretty chalk. Obviously, Roy, we haven't really seen in preseason, to my memory, but he was, a middle round pick. I think he was a late 4th round pick, if I remember correctly, maybe early 5th, but that's not a player you typically see get cut. And the training camp reports haven't been Willie Beavers level on him, right? Where Willie Beavers was just absolutely awful in his first training camp, if you remember, 6 or 7 years ago at this point, and deserved to get cut by roster cutdown day. I think the reports on Roy have been generally pretty positive, so I expect that he's staying on the roster, along with, Harrison Phillips obviously is the starter. Dean Lowry got enough money that he's probably expected to be the starter. Khyiris Tonga, I think, is clearly their best nose tackle on the team, and Jonathan Bullard, I think, played pretty decently last year. He especially played well in the preseason, but he played okay during the regular season as well. I expect him to have the leg up. You notice that I had Asezi Otomewo cut in this scenario. First of all, Otomewo's role, it seems like, has been more like Marcus Davenport and Patrick Jones than anything else. But I struggle to see him making this roster because I don't think he has the strength required to play the role that he's in. He was in the second half of the game yesterday, and that's when that huge run by Julius Chestnut, I think it was, for the Titans, having that 55-yard run, was attacking Asezi Otomewo and the backup linebacker Abraham Beauplan, where they just got spread so wide apart, right? So Otomewo was playing like a 3-tech kind of role, and Beauplan was playing a 9-tech or a 7 technique, and the tackle was able to just force Otomewo out, down kind of towards the center, and the tight end was able to push Beauplan out so far that there was literally Jay Ward took up like a quarter of the hole that was coming in. He had absolutely no shot at tackling the running back in that much space. So that's a huge concern to me, just that the strength doesn't seem to be there for Otomewo, and I don't think he adds a ton as a pass rusher, particularly, as an edge rusher, which is where he may be used rotationally. 2 players I wanted to shout out for great performances in the Titans game. By the flip side of that coin, we constantly had Malik Willis under pressure in that game, were TJ Smith and Sheldon Day. I thought TJ Smith acquitted himself very well as a nose tackle, and I think Tonga has been playing better than him during this preseason. But the Flores defense, or the Belichick defense has a history of keeping a ton of like defensive linemen who play a rotational role and just kind of beat up the opposing offensive line. A guy I think of a lot when thinking about the Flores defenses is Adam Butler, who's somebody who's completely unheralded. Nobody really remembers who that is, but he traveled a couple different places from New England to Miami with Flores because of the role that he can play as a nose tackle in that defense. In the 2018 Patriots run, they had Danny Shelton basically, I believe, on the practice squad all season, or he basically played 0 snaps, and then he like dominated the Super Bowl, or he dominated one of the championship games. He played a ton of snaps in the playoffs. So having those guys kind of on call and a Rolodex of those guys that you can bring in and give some snaps, especially if there are other injuries or if you have a specific game plan thing, is important for the team. And I think TJ Smith might be that. The other player I want to talk about here, I mentioned him with TJ Smith, is Sheldon Day, who looked frankly dominant in this game. It was somewhat reminiscent of T.Y. McGill last year, right? Who the Vikings, I think they tried to do an injury thing with him, and they ended up, coming to an injury settlement. And T.Y. McGill appears to be dominating in 49ers preseason games as well. I saw Brandon Thorne post a couple clips of him. But Sheldon Day looked quick. He looked powerful. He looked stout against run defense stuff. Obviously, you got to Malik Willis and force a sack. So if we were to have a shock and say Jonathan Bullard gets cut, because I think Bullard and Day fulfill kind of the same role, it wouldn't absolutely shock me if Day got that job over Bullard. I don't expect it to happen. I think it's probably just getting excited about a rotational player kind of beating up on backup offensive linemen. But I really did like Day's performance, so I just wanted to mention his name here. If we flip it over to the edge rusher position, obviously Danielle Hunter, Marcus Davenport are locks. DJ Wanham, by nature of not playing, I think is a lock. I'm still not in love with who he is as a player, but I think he's pretty obviously going to make the roster. Patrick Jones, I didn't catch playing in this Titans game, so that's another good sign for him. I mean, I always expected him to make the roster in the first place, and I thought he played pretty well in the handful of plays I saw him from the Seahawks, but it was good to see him, good to see that the Vikings think he's doing well as well. And then I kept Luigi Villain on the roster. I think based on his performance through the first 2 preseason games, it's going to be hard to keep him off of the roster. I thought he played extremely well against the Seahawks, and I thought he followed that up with a solid performance against the Titans. Nick and I kind of went in depth on him last week against the Seahawks, where I thought he did a number of things well. So I'm going to let that stand on its own. But those are the 5 edge rushers I would keep. I don't see the Vikings as able to keep Andre Carter on the roster at this point. He's just too raw. There were a number of situations where he got washed out. He doesn't really seem to have it as a pass rusher in general, and his processing of the game I don't love. There was a rollout, which I think ultimately it was Chigo Okonkwo who got free, but ultimately I think that was on Ivan Pace just through talking through with Luke Braun. But on that play, Andre Carter is the backside defensive end, so he's the side that the rollout is going to, and it takes him forever to recognize that there's a rollout going on. Like, he just isn't playing instinctually at this point. What he should have done in that scenario is peel off and go after the quarterback to try to make it an off-platform throw or make the throw difficult at all, and he just didn't even recognize it until the quarterback pretty much threw the football. So that's definitely a concern for me. Just feel for the game with Carter, and obviously, he's got a lot of questions coming from Army, not only the size or the weight and play strength questions, because you have to be under a certain weight while you're playing there, but also just the knowledge of the game I don't think I've really seen from him throughout this preseason so far. So my plan with him, and I don't, based on the tape he's put on preseason, I don't see how an NFL team could roster Andre Carter. So my expectation would be that he gets put on the practice squad. And that doesn't hurt the Vikings from a cap space perspective. You may remember that they gave him the most money, guaranteed money of any undrafted free agent in this cycle, which was $300,000. That $300,000 is about what practice squad players get paid. So if they cut him and they end up paying him $300,000 on the practice squad, it doesn't count any more against the Vikings cap than it would have. Like, it's not that $300,000 is not dead cap. It's fine because the Vikings are paying him that salary while he's on the practice squad. So flipping it over the linebackers, I think the 4 linebackers I have are pretty much chalk in what everybody has, and I think it's pretty obvious why. Brian Asamoah, who obviously hasn't played so far in the preseason, and Jordan Hicks, who also hasn't played, are going to be your 2 starters, I expect. There has been some steam about Ivan Pace Jr., who I have on the roster. Pace, I think, he's not as far along as somebody I would want starting for the Vikings, right? I mentioned that play earlier on a rollout where Okonkwo got completely wide open and ended up being a 15-yard game. Ultimately, I think what was supposed to happen on that play was Theo Jackson, who was originally a man coverage on him, was tried to pass the play off to Pace, which Pace should have taken once the guy went in motion the other way, but he just didn't recognize that. I think there's definitely some things for Pace in coverage where it's a feel for the game thing. He hasn't played coverage a ton. He didn't do it a ton at Cincinnati that he needs to get better at before I'd like to see him on the field every play. But man, is he fun to watch overall as a player, right? Like, he's so explosive. He's so good at taking on opposing offensive linemen. He's so good at just tackling guys, which is crazy to, the talk about him being undersized, I don't think is going to impact his game at the NFL level, but there are things that he needs to learn moving forward. And then I have Troy Dye on the roster as well. I think that's pretty self-explanatory based on where Troy Dye has been playing in these games. He hasn't done anything super astounding. Obviously, he had a great interception against the Titans, and I thought that play was actually pretty impressive. So maybe I walk back saying he hasn't done something super astounding, but I thought that play was pretty impressive from Dye's perspective. So that was a play-action play, and then the Titans were running a dagger concept, which has a vertical route from the number 2 receiver or the tight end. It might have been the tight end in this case, and then a dig route underneath it. The idea is to clear out space with the vertical route so the dig route can kind of come underneath. And the Vikings played a ton of man, you expect them to play a lot of man coverage. In this case, Dye would have been in man coverage on the tight end. So what Malik Willis saw from his perspective on this play was Dye turned around and running with the tight end. In reality, it was cover 3. And as soon as Willis loads up to throw, Dye turns around to look at the quarterback. So his responsibility as the hook player in that scenario was to carry the tight end up to the second level. And once the tight end gets past a certain landmark, he turns around and looks at the quarterback trying to find stuff underneath. And it so happens that Dye turns around and the ball comes directly to him for an interception. So I would just say it was a good execution of the design of the defense by the Vikings and by Dyer in particular to kind of have his head turned around running with the player, which is what fooled Willis into thinking the window would have been open for him to throw the dig. And if Dye had stayed with the vertical route, if he had stayed trying to cover that route, it very much would have opened up the dig, but Dye turned around and then the ball's right in his hands and he makes the catch. So that was nice from Dye. I don't think Troy Reeder had a very good game. There was one nice tackle I saw him play, but then he was slow to trigger and run defense. I think he was also part of a culprit in terms of from a linebacker perspective on that big chestnut run that I talked about. So they're just, I haven't seen anything from Dye that would make me put him, I'm sorry, I haven't seen anything from Reeder that would make me put him on the roster, and Dye played a ton of special team snaps, so I don't think that Reeder has a special teams advantage over Dye either, so I think ultimately Dye gets the win and makes the roster over Troy Reeder in this scenario. The cornerback room, I think, is pretty interesting to me. I mentioned earlier how I think the Vikings ultimately need to keep at least 9 offensive linemen. So that means Udo or Sloatman, or Chris Reed, maybe they move on from. But if they could theoretically keep all 10 of those guys as well. So even if Nick Muse with the 3 tight ends doesn't make the roster, if the Vikings offense wants to keep the 6 wide receivers, including Rager, and then the 10 offensive linemen, that leaves you down a position on defense where you can only keep 24 players. And the struggle is the cornerback room, and the real person who has made that a struggle, in my opinion, is Najee Thompson. Najee Thompson has been so excellent on special teams. He's just been absolutely phenomenal. That I think the Vikings have to keep him on the roster. Like, I don't think there's a question of whether or not he should make the roster, because he's going to be a starting and a key special teams player for this team. Like, the value you get from a punt gunner with Najee Thompson's skill level from what we've seen in the preseason is actually pretty high, because it can save you, 10 yards a game, which is way more than you see from a lot of players at less valuable positions, at least from like a pure analytics EPA perspective. So I think Najee Thompson has to make the roster. Coaches love guys who are that active and that into special teams. I don't think he's really anything at all as a cornerback, right? I haven't seen him specifically from the cornerback perspective, but just based on my understanding of his college profile, which was as a special teamer, I'm not expecting much from him from the cornerback room. So the Vikings locks, obviously, are Byron Murphy, Caleb Evans, and Mekhi Blackman. And that leaves a couple of players in Andrew Booth and Joejuan Williams who suddenly have a little bit of roster pressure if you're keeping Najee Thompson, right? Keeping 5 corners makes a lot of sense. Keeping 6 corners becomes a little bit difficult. I'm not ready to give up on Andrew Booth Jr. just yet. Obviously, Nick and I both really liked Andrew Booth throughout the draft process. I still think he's shown some good things, particularly in the second preseason game. He did let up one reception where he was kind of playing outside leverage. I thought he could have triggered a little bit better and kind of stuck a little bit more with that route, even though it was an in-breaking route against outside leverage as a corner. He really didn't have any inside help in that scenario, so that's just something that you need to play better as a corner, frankly. But Booth stuck with opposing receivers quite well in this game, by my estimation. I think he has shown a couple of promising games, even if he did let up that, bad touchdown to Jake Bobo in the first game. I think he also missed tackle in run defense in the flat in this game. That's going to happen for corners sometimes. Booth is not the greatest tackling player. He's willing to throw his body in there, and he certainly was willing to do so at Clemson. But he's not going to be, like your Mike Hilton of a corner. So it's just kind of what you get sometimes with cornerbacks there. Joejuan Williams, I had cut in this roster prediction scenario. I thought he played very poorly against the Titans. There were a number of plays where receivers got open against him. There was one where Malik Willis just completely overthrew a guy, but he had, probably a 30-yard play where Williams got roasted. There was another one where he let a receiver basically have free access on a dig route over the middle of the field. I thought Williams was not playing particularly well in this game, and I've been a little bit down on Williams, I think, compared to the consensus, but I kind of see him as that type of player, like if you remember, I think it was Jordan, no, it wasn't Jordan Fuller, it was Jordan Taylor, who was a Broncos receiver who Gary Kubiak brought in 2019, who everybody during OTAs and stuff was like, oh, he's going to be the wide receiver 3. He's running, with the first team, basically. He was really just brought in to teach the offense, the new kind of strategy that was coming in on offense. I think that's a similar thing for Joejuan Williams on the defense. He was a former second-round pick, so he has talent, but he really hasn't made an NFL roster or played significant snaps, so I don't think it's really reasonable to expect him to do so with the Vikings this year either. Now, if we move on to the safety position, I think it's pretty chalk as well. Obviously Harrison Smith, Cameron Bynum, Josh Metellus, those are your big ones. Lewis Seen, I think is obviously a keep. The only question to me is, do we keep 5 safeties? I think with the amount of dime we're going to play, we almost certainly keep 5 safeties, and Jay Ward, to me, is that 5th safety, is somebody who's a promising draft pick, but I like what I've seen from Theo Jackson as well throughout the preseason. So if the Vikings are willing to, quickly move on from some of the draft picks they made, Theo Jackson might take a spot. Or if they keep one less corner, they could keep theoretically 6 safeties. I think that would look a little bit silly, on paper, but Josh Metellus isn't really going to play a true safety role. He's going to play a dime backer or a tight end eraser role or a slot defender role, right? When the Vikings play kind of big nickel packages. So that kind of is a slot cornerback spot. It's just a safety is playing that role instead. So it's theoretically possible for somebody like Theo Jackson to make the roster. I thought, like I said, he's played pretty well. He deserves to be at least a fringe roster player who's mentioned this discussion. I just don't know if he's ultimately going to make the team. I would keep it to Harrison Smith, obviously, Cam Bynum, Jay Ward, Lewis Cine, and Josh Metellus. Now, Lewis Cine, who I think is a roster spot, obviously played for the vast majority of this game as well. And I think we still saw something very similar to what we saw in the game against the Titans. He had a couple of awesome plays, right? It's like the first play of the game. Again, he comes up to the line of scrimmage, makes a great play. He gets a sack, I believe, on it was counted as a sack in a goal line scenario where Malik Willis rolls out and he, triggers on the rollout, gets a sack of him in that situation. He's been great coming forward. He showed a couple better tackle attempts. Then there was a huge Tyjae Spears run where he came up into the hole and just completely whiffed on the tackle attempt. He didn't break down well. He didn't get a good wrap on Tyjae Spears. He didn't do a good job. It was a pretty wide hole, so it was a difficult tackle attempt, but you'd like to see a player who's, a first-round safety make that sort of play to see progress. And then on the back end, when he's in coverage, I think he's been pretty good coming forward, pretty good in man coverage. It's just the deep zones that have really been giving him trouble throughout this preseason. There was another play that was a very similar concept to the play he got on last week. We kind of talked about it in detail, where he's a cover 3 safety and he has to take the deep crosser that's coming across against the Yankee concept while the corner to his side takes the post. It looks like in this scenario that Cine tried to make a call, he raised his arm up on this crosser, but he was hesitant and he was late to it. It could have also been the case that Theo Jackson needed to get more depth on this play, but I think ultimately I put it on Cine because the post on the other side of the field, Andrew Booth was covering. It's really Joejuan Williams' responsibility to pass it off to Cine in the Flores defense, to my understanding. The corners are the ones who make the calls, not the safeties, when it's coverage adjustments in terms of players coming inside or coming underneath them in a cover 3 defense. So that's my understanding of that play, and I do put it on Cine. Fortunately for the Vikings, Willis just missed the throw. I don't think Malik Willis, by the way, is all that good of a quarterback. He only had 7 incompletions, but all 7 of those throws felt like they were to open players that were just inaccurate passes that the players weren't able to bring down. The Vikings got a little bit fortunate, I think, from a box score perspective in coverage because Willis wasn't able to hit on some of these throws. And maybe it does make a couple players look better than they actually played. But for Lewis Cine, I think the speed of the game is there for him. When he sees everything correctly and he trusts himself, it's there and he can do it. The problem is he's not processing everything as quickly as he needs to be, and that's something that absolutely needs to shore up before he can see the field. I think he's somewhat fortunate to be on a Vikings team that has a number of good safeties and young safeties on rookie contracts like Cam Bynum and Josh Metellus, who we have developed into better players that Cine doesn't need to see the field. That Cam Bynum statement may be a little controversial. I think Cam Bynum is a good deep safety who was just simply bad in run defense this year, and I don't think he's going to be asked to do the run defense to the level that he was last year. So I think that's very much going to help our perception of him going into the season. But Cine very clearly isn't there as a deep player in terms of reading the game, so he's not somebody I'd want taking over Cam Bynum's role or what I project his role to be in this defense. I'd rather have him take over a role similar to what Josh Metellus is doing, or eventually a role similar to what Harrison Smith is doing, because I think he's been better playing forward, and I think that might continue. So obviously, I should mention probably Greg Joseph, Ryan Wright, Andrew DePaula are the de facto specialists on this team. We don't really need to go too deep into them, other than Greg Joseph has made all of his kicks in this preseason, so I guess that's probably pretty good. With all of that being said, I think I'm going to wrap it up here today. I am Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football. And thank you for riding with me through this solo podcast. Hopefully it wasn't too bad just listening to one person talk the entire time, kind of ramble on about some of these players. Hopefully you got something out of it. You can also find Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. You can find Gregg Blake at You've Been Gregged on Instagram. You can find the show at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And Skull Vikings.
Goal, baby.
Another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind. And we'll score the old Vikings along. We'll score